Hey, welcome back, everyone. Today we are talking about UFOs. We're going to get real deep into the subject. There's a lot to cover. And with us is Keith Thompson, the author of The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon. Now, Keith's an independent journalist. You might have seen him on CNN, Larry King more specifically, or in the New York Times. He's also a former Senate staffer, talk radio host, TV host. Keith's been studying this subject for a long time, and Keith's actually so well read in this, he's influenced a number of people you may be familiar with. Most notably, John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who studied abductions, as well as Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist responsible for the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces that inspired George Lucas to an extent when writing Star Wars. So Keith is going to talk to us about all aspects of the phenomenon, and it's really interesting. He has what I think is one of the more unique takes on the subject. So buckle up, get ready for a really awesome discussion, and welcome today's Paradigm Sherpa, Keith Thompson. Thank you again for being kind enough to share some time today. I read the book over the past 2 weeks and was thoroughly impressed, both in the quality of the research and as well as just things that you surfaced that were new to me. And so I'm hoping maybe we can just try and keep this conversational, but I did have some things that I was hoping to, ask you. I'm trying to go in the chronology of the book, but it's okay if we veer left or right, just or however the conversation takes us. I want this to be as organic and fun as possible.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's no, in finishing the book, I realized there's not a real chronological through line or conceptual through line. It's like at some level, I think I wanted each of the chapters to be able to sort of stand alone.
Sure.
So in that sense, I think I've probably succeeded largely, but it's as you know, it covers many different, not only different things, but different kinds of things. I mean, some of the key figures in the field, explanatory, interpretive efforts to make sense of the UFO, some of the great stories. So anyway, we could start at the beginning if you'd like.
Early on in the book, you uh, make mention of, well, what are we really talking about here? Are we talking about a phenomenon, which implies something singular, but then there's potentially many facets to it? Or are we talking about phenomena as plural? And,
Exactly.
I was wondering maybe, we hear UFO, people's minds immediately go to flying saucer, aliens from another world, little green men. But what we're talking about is a lot more complex than that, isn't it?
Well, it is, and the funny thing about the phrase UFO, it was originally chosen by the military because it was supposedly not as loaded as the phrase flying saucers had become. So they simply UFO, unidentified flying object. There's something unidentified. It's in the sky, and it appears to be an object. You could almost add appears to be in all three of those. It appears to be unidentified. But it's unidentified in terms of what? I mean, that usually means it's not identified in terms of something mundane, misidentification of a natural phenomenon, and it's unidentified by witnesses and put forward as unidentified. That generally, though, when I was working on the book, unidentified flying object, when I would tell people I'm doing a book on UFOs, they'd say, "Oh, do you think they're real? And I mean, do you think that these are aliens?" And I just became used to the fact that that was a jump into an interpretation. UFO already meant flying saucers from outer space. So the military has attempted to balance this in the last 3 or 4 years or more, when they finally conceded that they had a Pentagon task force that was studying this phenomenon, investigating this phenomenon, even though the official stance toward UFOs had been ridicule, denial, nothing's going on here. You folks can go back home. So they changed the acronym. I say that the phenomenon got an acronym upgrade from UFO to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And there, the same effort, the same desire apparently was in play to try to find a more neutral phrase that doesn't have the connotations even of UFOs. But it's a tricky game. Yeah, is it, phenomenon is a singular term. There are, it may be a mistake to try to say, well, what is a UFO when it, in some of its manifestations, appears to be a physical object with solid criteria meeting, there's a temperature signature, a heat signature. It is shown to have a geometric position consistent with an object in the sky. When it comes down to the radar and other sensors pick it up. At the same time, those same objects, apparent craft, very often would appear to be craft, whether they're saucer shaped or shaped like something else, are prone to simply disappear on the spot or to break into two craft, and then further breaking into various orbs of light that are various densities, from opaque, like metal, to translucent, the light shining through it. And then the object will very often disappear into the ground. Well, that's like, if the first criteria, the first set of descriptions are very much like a physical object, but those are physical descriptions. This is almost anti-physical. The same object being able to disappear, almost ghost-like, or move through walls. So those are phenomena that make it very easy. Those are characteristics that make it very easy for skeptics to say, this is ludicrous, this is absurd, these are certainly not aliens. That's very often the debunkers will say, there's no sign of aliens from outer space in this phenomenon. That is a very kind of funny, loaded statement. You don't have to assert that it's aliens from outer space to assert that the criteria or the characteristics I just mentioned are real or apparently real, but maybe not necessarily connected with other outer space. It might well be that these are from other dimensions. String theory in physics talks about anywhere between 11 and 26 dimensions. So anyway, it's a wide open game about about how to interpret these sightings.
Yeah, and I certainly haven't been following this as long as you have, but I've been looking at this for at least a decade, and I'm no closer to determining whether these are physical objects, von Neumann AI space probes, other dimensional entities, the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis that they might be something that's inherent to Earth that keeps a low profile, so to speak. So it's the journey continues, I guess, to determine, until more evidence presents itself, what exactly these things are. But I think what you kind of allude to in the book is that we need to, consider that we don't have the whole picture of reality, and thus, things that don't maybe appear quote unquote normal to us should still be considered with the evidence. Just because something dissolves in a ghost-like fashion doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it's a lie or unreal. It might just mean that us, the interpreter of the events, doesn't quite have the full picture of reality, and thus we can only report what we see with our five senses or sensory instruments.
Exactly, or through telescopes, microscopes. I mean, we all use, many branches of science use different kind of instrumentation. You're probably aware that in the past year or so, a military intelligence official named David Grush came forward. I don't write about him in the book because I was really ending the book when he was coming out with his stories, and it's just not a good time to try to expand to include. But what Grush has come forward, he's a Air Force intelligence, I believe, military intelligence, I'll say, with a pretty high standing in terms of access to classified material. He has alleged that there are recovered saucers, recovered alien craft, non-human craft, and also recovered what he calls biologics. Sort of implies biological, but this term, it's a noun he uses, biologics. And that is very likely, almost certainly, he says, it's been offloaded to the aerospace corporations. So right. that was recovered by maybe government and a combination in hybrid in cooperation with aerospace industries. But say McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed Martin have these craft allegedly in their hangars somewhere. So that would, okay, that's an empirical challenge. He has delivered the names and dates and locations apparently to the Inspector General of the intelligence community. I maintain that even if it is revealed that there are craft, that will not explain all the aspects of the UFO phenomenon, including the paranormal. That's a big part of where I focus on in the book, that there are, first of all, the evidence for the paranormal, let me just simply say to your viewers, is very well established now. Laboratory evidence, the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, their chief scientist, Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N. I mention his name because you can Google it if you have any doubt about the quality of the gold standard lab research they've done, proving telepathy, clairvoyance, strongly confirming telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. I bring that into the book because this phenomenon has recurring psychic dimensions, telepathic dimensions. We can go into specific cases. So it's more than what can be, whatever's found, if there's something found in hangars somewhere that's consistent with our current physics, well, that'll be quite revealing in and of itself. But there's still going to be aspects of the phenomenon, the paranormal, that pose a fundamental challenge to the Western model of science, which depends on a strict divide between physical and mental realms. There's just a bridge that can't be crossed. I can't have direct access to the contents of your mind in Western science, but in fact, people do have telepathic and clairvoyant and precognitive experience. That is to say, they have a dream, precognitive dream, of walking down a certain street and turning around a corner and seeing someone. And the next day, they're walking down the street, turning the corner, and they see that person. Sort of like deja vu, but it isn't quite the same as that. In any case, how does that work? What's going on in that? So I maintain that to get to the bottom or to inquire into this, we're going to have to be willing to inquire into a different kind of paradigm of science that opens to the evidence of phenomena that promiscuously crosses that divide between mind and matter, and it shows it to be a permeable boundary rather than an iron curtain.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that's one of the unique things about your book that I really cherished was that, you mentioned folks like Jung and, his perspective on synchronicity, how that might hint that there is this connection between mind and matter that is unseen. And, I think the duality of present day scientific paradigm suggests, Newtonian physics, matter is distinct from consciousness, or rather matter, produces consciousness as an epiphenomenon. But some reports related to UFO and UAP suggest that there is an impact on the consciousness of the people who have the experience. And that seems to suggest, as you just mentioned, there's more than potentially nuts and bolts here craft, or if there is, it's not necessarily the full picture.
Well, let's just go right to the start of the contemporary UFO. I call it the creation story. I use the term, or I call it creation myth, and the creation myth. And I use the term myth in a positive way. In the Western mind, we very often say myth means something fanciful, probably false. It's a myth rather than the truth. It's a myth rather than a fact. I go deeper than that with the term. Let's just say a story. Myth is a story that endures and also points to something that is not only true but deeply true. So the creation myth, but when I say creation myth, I'm referring to indigenous cultures that very often do have a creation myth that is taught to the younger members of the community in typically male initiation as well as female initiation. The older males will gather the young boys. The men will be wearing masks, mythic masks, so that the boys don't know that it's their own fathers. The mothers know that it is, and they come into the house and spirit the boys away, and the mothers cry, "Oh no, don't take my son." So the boys are supposed to be scared. There is a rite of passage going on, and you have to be separated from your current classification as a boy. And then for over a period of days, you're in the initiation hut, and you were taught the And this is the point. You're taught the myths about your people's origin. This is who we are. This is where our ancestors came from. So it's a repetition of the defining story of the myth. Very often, by the way, the tribe or the community's ancestors came from the sky. So that's, just an interesting commonality in myth. So in any case, the creation story of the UFO phenomenon begins in 1947, by my reckoning, when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying in a private plane over Mount Rainier, and he saw 9 objects flying in formation. He's a very skilled pilot. He was able to determine the speeds, which were very rapid, but he was able to do that very quickly. He called it in, and he said that he was seeing objects skipping through the air the way a saucer would skip over water. He described the motion. That was understood and translated to the news media that was listening to apparently the tower's broadcast as he was reporting flying saucers. It was reported that he saw objects shaped like saucers, which was an interesting linguistic snafu, kind of a mangling of the term. But right there's an ambivalence built into the creation myth. But that isn't what was reported. It was reported that more than how they moved, it was how they were shaped. So he allegedly saw 9 flying saucers. Well, what it took some years to surface was the full story. And that is that Arnold had told his daughter, by the way, he was already identified with being probably the kook who came up with flying saucers. He never really lived it down in terms of his identity in the conventional world. So he wasn't interested in going forward with the rest of the story, but he told his daughter and he told his family. And all of this is prefaced to talking about this convergence between the mental and the physical that's not supposed to be able to happen. First of all, he described to his daughter, she said after her father had passed away, she came out, did an interview, said, "My father was always perplexed by the idea that he had reported metal craft, high tech, nuts and bolts, extraterrestrial craft, nothing of the kind. My father said the 9 objects he saw seemed to be almost breathing. They changed their shape and form from more dense or opaque to less dense and more translucent, blue and white light." She said that her father described them as having the heart, the same as the human heartbeat, beating to the rhythms of the human heart. Well, that right there is a description that I can sure understand why he didn't come forward with that at the time. Call that in, because he very likely, in order to keep his pilot's license, would have had to pass a psychiatric exam, especially in 1947 in the post-war period. So furthermore, he said that he told his daughter that he had a sense, he had a deep intuition. Something struck him, and he was not given to visionary experiences. He, there was no history of being anything like a prophet, but he said he felt that these objects, whatever they were coming from another dimension, and that it was the dimension that is the same as where we go after this life. They are related to death, the afterlife. So here the news report focused on something extraterrestrial. But in fact, what Arnold described and kept to himself was that they were more eschatological. Now, that's a fancy term from theology that refers to matters relating to the end of a life, the end of times, the final era, the revelation, the soul, the transmigration of the soul, the afterlife. So if that story had been reported at the time, we conceivably would have started this creation myth. The very start of the UFO phenomenon would have had a very different start, very different theme involved. One more thing that relates to this question of synchronicity, the convergence of mental and physical states. He went home that same day. He lived in Boise, Idaho. So as pilots do, they fly to their home airport, put the plane up for the night, and get in their car and go home. When he went home to his residence in the usual neighborhood, the usual community, the house had orbs of light flashing in it that night and other nights. That had never happened before. So whatever he encountered that day was in some way connected with him, with his consciousness, with his psyche. To use a term that has been popularized in recent years, he brought something home with him. that sometimes it's called the hitchhiker effect, which was popularized through this television show related to the Utah rural ranch that is sometimes called a paranormal Disneyland, a vast display of paranormal, non-ordinary phenomena that sometimes does seem to follow people home from the ranch and result in paranormal displays of this form in the house. Well, again, there were a huge set of details there that are not consistent with the early reported, well, objects and flying saucers, spacecraft were seen in the sky. That isn't what he reported. And the fact that it came home with him by his report, certainly I can understand why he kept it to himself. But the fact that it came home with him and he kept it within the family was a significant detail. So I did my reporting. I was not the first to discover his daughter's statement because it was a public statement, but I don't know anybody else who has really delved into the significance of that shift and what he actually saw. I title my chapter, What Ken Arnold Really Saw, and the implications for, it's as if the creation myth is continuing to evolve. And these new details create a tapestry far more complex than based on the original news media reports of Arnold's sighting.
It certainly suggests that the origins story or the beginning of the myth is not static and it is evolving. I mean, as somebody who's studied this for 10 years plus, your book was the first time I became hip to the idea that Arnold, I knew that he was describing the saucer-like movement, but I didn't really comprehend that it wasn't related to the shape as well. And I mean, there's a huge divergence from the popular myth and narrative that that was describing the shape versus, what Arnold told his daughter about, hey, I felt like this was from another dimension. It was almost pulsing like a human heartbeat, and I felt like it was related to where we go after we die. I mean, that's a very profound thing for I don't know much about Arnold beyond the incident, but from what you're describing, it wasn't a guy that necessarily seemingly was tuned into or interested in the other world or other dimensions at that point. This interaction is what changed him and gave him that feeling, right?
Exactly. So it came away. It's a little bit like you could think of Ezekiel's wheel in the Bible,
Sure.
or the burning Moses and the burning bush. This is not to say that those are UFOs in the Bible. That's the wrong frame of reference to go that way. It's that there are events in the Bible and in religious traditions involving seers and prophets and visionaries that are miraculous, quote unquote. There are displays of light. Very often they are displays of light, luminosity. So that's one reason I make a connection thematically between the UFO phenomenon and the near-death phenomenon and psychic phenomena in general. I open to a broader frame in a way that does justice to each of the frames. So, by the way, as for the shape of the nine, at the time he said they skipped through the air like a saucer over water, but he described them as being shaped like stingrays. So, stingray having a certain almost wings off to the side. And so unidentified flying stingrays didn't come out of it. Flying stingrays was not what came out of this. It was flying saucers. So people began to receive flying saucers. Now, I'm not making a simplistic statement that because Kenneth Arnold was mistakenly reported as having seen saucers, that somehow shaped everyone's expectation and causing them to see saucers. But it is still interesting that the expectation was in some sense there. That's not the only shape of UFOs. So some are cigar shaped, some are tic tac shaped, as we know from the last several years of coverage of what happened off the coast of California with the aircraft carrier. There are all kinds of shapes. So it is a bedlam almost of interpret. That's why I bring in the Greek god Proteus at one point. I say, think about the Greek god Proteus was a shapeshifter. He could appear as a dragon, as a jaguar, as a person, as a tree, as an animal. He would change receive shape in the way that mythology makes it possible to do so, and as mythological figures often do. The reason I bring in mythological figures is because it's a way to imagine the complexity of what these events are about. I mean, it really does. There is an imaginal dimension to this phenomenon, not imaginary, but we need language for a faculty of cognition in which the imagination plays a central role. We tend to say imagination means made up or unreal. Imaginal refers to the function of imagination as a sense organ, almost, in perceiving phenomena that are very often subtle. So there's a whole line of exploration we could go down if we want. There's just so many, in many ways we could come at every point.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad you said that. So perceiving things that, are kind of outside the norm. That makes me think of a story I heard when you know, the Spanish arrived in South America on ships, and you know, the indigenous couldn't even recognize what the ships were because they hadn't seen them before, and I think they attributed them to being Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, because that's what fit within their narrative. Now, I mean, I think the Spanish may have played on that to help get a warmer reception, right? But the point being, like, if you haven't seen something before, it doesn't fit inside your typical framework of reality, it might be hard to actually even perceive something for the first time.
Absolutely. There's two related activities of cognition. One is assimilation. You see something that you don't recognize, you don't understand, you really don't fully identify what it is. You do your best. I mean, it's not a conscious process, but all your cognitive apparatus is oriented toward assimilating that into your current framework. Finding some unidentified flying object temporarily means you can't assimilate it into any of the known categories. And if you cannot at some point assimilate it, then what's required is your cognition needs to accommodate to the perceived object. So assimilation means try to bring the object into your current framework. Accommodating to a phenomenon means opening your framework to include something different and changing your framework. And that's the essence of what I think we're dealing with here. I think this is a phenomenon that is attempting to change our framework. I refer to, and I think it is an intelligence. So, non-human intelligence is the phrase often used, NHI, within the UFO investigation community. It's almost as if this is a phenomenon that is, I call it in the book, I refer to it as a call from the cosmos. The UFO is a call from the cosmos. It's a call to us to expand our maps of science and self and society to include not only these anomalies, but the anomaly of the near-death experience, the phenomena that go on there, and also paranormal findings in general. It's a call for us to do that. And I describe a call as only a monologue until it's answered. I mean, you get a call in your life, you get a call to take on a new adventure, to move to a new city, to change your relationship, to change the fabric of your life in some fundamental way. A call can come in many ways. In spiritual communities, it's literally the call to worship begins with the ringing of a bell, usually, or some other kind of sound that is made symbolically to say it's time to come to worship. It's time to come to meditation. It's time to come to prayer. So symbolically, metaphorically, I say that in the same sense, this is calling us to a new kind of attention, to pay attention in a new way. We're being asked something. Are we willing to answer? So that's when the dialogue begins. A call is simply a monologue until we choose to answer. And how we choose to answer is evident in the various ways we do. There's one response, which is, I describe in the book at great length, the difference between genuine skepticism, scientific skepticism that says, okay, this appears to be something new. I don't know what it is. I'm going to assume provisionally that it can be explained in conventional terms, but I'm willing to investigate it. That's genuine skepticism. And also the continuous inquiry into your skepticism to your own conclusions. It's important not to fool ourselves, and we fool ourselves more than anybody else fools us. So it's important to be skeptical about our own hypotheses and theories and assumptions. But there's a different character in the UFO field, in these UFO debates, and that's the debunker. The debunker are these various people who are often called by TV producers to appear in an hour-long show on the UFO phenomenon. They generally get the last 15 minutes. First, we interview the witnesses. Then we interview sympathetic researchers like, say, John Mack of Harvard University. We might want to talk about John Mack, who I got to know. And then in the final 15 minutes, Oprah will bring on the skeptic, the scientist who tells us why this is almost certainly not happening the way the witnesses. And that's not genuine skepticism. The debunker generally says the witness could not have been accurate. It could not have happened because such things don't happen. We know that from, quote, the laws of physics or the laws of nature. Well, the laws of nature is just too broad a phrase to say it's something new. That would be an appropriate response, but it can't happen. Well, as Sir William Crookes, the English researcher of paranormal things, he did not start out that way. He famously responded to a debunker. He said, "I never said it was possible. I only said it's true." And that's pretty much my approach with this book. I don't know how it's possible. I don't know that it is possible. I know that officially these are impossible events. Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University has written quite a bit about impossible phenomenon, by which he means officially impossible. Right. It doesn't pass the frameworks, but they are phenomena that have been part of human experience for millennia. So, yeah.
So Keith, you're talking about the call, and you seem to have answered the call to open your mind to be willing to entertain new paradigms that the UFO brings into the world. Like you said, certainly things it does or UFOs do are often deemed impossible from current scientific paradigms. But I'm wondering if we can almost take a step back. I do want to start talking about John Mack. I found it so interesting that your book or your part of Stanislav Grof's book is what kind of got Mack into this field. But real quick too, I was so impressed how you look at the phenomenon through the lens of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and what you were just talking about with the call. You kind of break down Campbell's hero's journey into the 3 stages. There's the separation, transition, and assimilation. And it seems like at a minimum, people who see a UFO or get interested in the UFOs, that is part of the separation experience, maybe towards building a new consciousness or a new paradigm of reality. I was wondering, maybe since we've started talking about the call, if you can talk about the other 2 stages as well, the transition and the assimilation, because I think that you're probably the first person that I've read in the UFO world that brings Campbell into the mix, and I think it's highly appropriate.
Well, thank you. And I was fortunate just in terms of the path I have forged or the way life has used me so far, that I had an opportunity to get to know Joseph Campbell, after he had retired from teaching at Sarah Lawrence, before Bill Moyers had made him famous with that PBS, The Power of Myth, which put him on the landscape as a major cultural figure. To the media exposure, and it was a 10-part series exploring deeply through conversations, long-form interviews. So I was able to take some workshops with Joseph Campbell. When he retired, he developed a new career of giving workshops at various retreat centers around the country, usually human potential type exploration centers. So I got to know him, and I became enamored of his 3 stages. The first, as you say, is he described how, and by the way, The Hero with 1,000 Faces is the name of his book, and the hero's journey is the common template he felt, or the template that is common to all mythology. He calls it the monomyth, the plot structure that appears again and again and again in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Mesopotamian, Eastern cultures, Western, Pacific culture. I mean, all cultures are all around them. So what he found with the 3 stages, the first is a hero, the protagonist is called into action. There's a separation. Very often, just by going about his business, the protagonist makes contact with a world he gets a call to adventure, as Campbell put it. And it can take many different forms. I describe it as a kind of, I use the phrase cosmos interruptus. There's a break in your sense and the very structure of reality often. And in a UFO experience, for sure, a near-death experience, there's an extreme separation from the reality that you believe you knew. Then there's very often a middle ground, as you say, it's the transitional period. You're in the margins. You are officially betwixt and between. For example, in the indigenous societies, the boys are separated from their mother. They're taken to an initiation hut. They're no longer boys, but they're not yet men. Because in the initiation hut, what they will be going through are a series of initiations, rites of passage, involving hunting, involving learning the myths, reciting the myths, involving other skills in nature, fasting, solo periods, going out alone into the depths of the wilderness. So that's a metaphor for being in the depths of the wilderness, making contact with what the psychologists, including Jung, would call the unconscious. But that's a rather technical term. In mythology, it's very often the deep and dark forest, and there's no easy path out. And it is during that period, it can be comparable to Jesus's 40 days and nights in the desert, that trial he went through. So then eventually, if the initiation, if the rite of passage is complete, the third stage is sometimes called aggregation, the return, or assimilation. When Campbell said the hero's journey is never complete until he or she brings back what he called a boon of some kind, B-O-O-N, a reward, an insight, some new teaching for the culture, some new invention, some new map of where we could go next. Maybe the map is received in some form of knowledge, like an illumination, as a result of fasting. So I use the rite of passage three-stage model because I kept seeing it emerge over and over. For example, well, let me give it just a quick example. The Zimbabwe school sighting, aerial school sighting in 1994. 65 school children at recess saw a craft land with beings walking, strange beings, stepping outside and walking in a very strange way. One of the young students, Emily Trim, age 8, made eye contact at a very deep level with the dark eyes of this non-ordinary, non-human being, by all accounts. And there was a sense of transfer of information. It was a telepathic exchange that she later reported to John Mack, who flew in to investigate this. The point I want to make is that was her separation from reality, from normal conventional. She was abruptly set. How did it happen? As an 8-year-old girl on a schoolyard recess playground. That's how it happened. She didn't go on any specific rite of passage. She didn't seek to have an ordeal that would lead her. When people go on a long solo camping trip, very often the goal is to have a rite of passage. It's specifically to have a transformative experience. That wasn't what she was up to that day, but it took her out of her normal frame, and she entered a long period of what I call in the book a kind of wasteland. Her parents, who were fundamental Christians, Bible-based Christians, said to Emily, "What you and your brothers say you saw, you didn't. It didn't happen." And well, that's a way of simply, dismissing what she did experience. We don't know what was seen, but we know what was experienced, what they reported seeing. They did drawings independently, all the students, and they were not exactly the same, but they all came up with similar stuff. They were interviewed separately. So there was a strong case to be made that something was seen. Some interaction did take place. The parents said, "You didn't see it." The parents took Emily and her younger brother, who was at the school, out of the school. They returned to Canada. It was their private. They were in Africa as a private school. So for many years back in Canada, it's safe to say Emily did not thrive. Her life was not going well. She went through. She was engaged to be married. That was broken off. It was not a life that was shaping up fruitfully. Then she got a an invitation from some girls who remained at the school. Said, "Dear Emily, we hope this reaches you well. We're putting together a reunion of our class. I know it's a long way from Canada, but could you come?" That was the call for her to complete. She didn't know it. She didn't know it as such, but she had a strong. She would not have used the word call. She had no idea that she was in a rite of passage. That's my frame for what she was going through. And this began the third stage because she said, "I have to go back. I know that I need to go back. This isn't finished." That's very also there's a remaining task. And the adversaries that her parents had been the adversaries in a sense. They were doing what they thought was best for her by taking her mind off of this. They thought it was best for her not to believe her own eyes and ears that day. So she went back to Africa. She hung out with her students, fellow students who were all many years older. And one of them asked her, "Would you like to go? I've talked with a local spiritual teacher named Duke of the indigenous faith here. Would you like to go out and talk with him? He would be happy to have you stop by if you'd like to meet him." And Emily, many years later, said, "Yes, I would like to go. How is it possible that I was a student at this school and we didn't even know about that indigenous? We didn't have contact with the indigenous people. I would like to. I'd like to have a conversation about what happened." So he went and he said, What have you come back for, Emily?" And she kind of stuttered and stammered that she was back to spend time with her friends and try to understand what had happened. And he said to her, "You're really asking whether you should speak of what happened?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You must. You must speak." And they talked about the fact that her parents had said, "Don't speak of this. Don't deal with it." Well, her parents had actually begun to shift. They'd begun to realize something did happen that day. They had read the news stories that it was seen throughout Zimbabwe in the skies later. There were other witnesses. So he told her, "Indeed, you must speak of this. You were a child, and it is often out of the mouths of children that deep truths can be spoken." So she completed the experience in a very profound way. She went back to Canada. She was an artist. Most of her artwork had been dark, black and white, gloomy, noir type scenes. She suddenly, almost like a Wizard of Oz scenario, began to work with color, multiple colors. Her life went from monochrome to multicolored. Her life lit up. Anyway, so the point is, a happy ending? Yes, it's a happy ending. In the sense that any experience that is fully completed is a positive outcome. What doesn't get finished in our lives? I mean, we know this from elemental psychology that an unprocessed trauma will remain unprocessed. It stays and it becomes a kind of vigilance system on the lookout constantly for any other trauma similar to what happened. So the classic example would be if you're mugged going down the street, you won't go down that street anymore. You won't go down many other streets. You'll avoid streets that look that way. You'll avoid people who look like the person who mugged you. You create a very wide net of avoidance of a lot of things that remind you of that. And until you deal with it through some kind of therapy, broadly speaking, some kind of process of inquiry, your life will remain an unfinished piece. Whereas when you do process it, you do investigate it, it will dissolve essentially like any other experience, and it just becomes part of your frame of reference. So it's a description of how I make use of Campbell's thinking.
Yeah, and I really appreciated how you took us on Emily's journey. For me, it seemed like moving away was almost like refusing the call, and that had the detrimental effect. But then it, kept coming back and kept coming back, and she eventually accepted it, and then went into the forest and returned with the bullion or the gold or the precious nugget or gift from the unconscious or the underworld.
And the refusal of the call, as you know, the refusal of the call is a specific stage in Campbell's wonderful hero's journey model. It's very often done as a circle from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, all the stages you go through. And there are adversaries that you meet. There are unexpected allies. There's the original refusal of the call. And when the protagonist, to refuse the call is to say no, this isn't for me. I must stay home. but the call continues to call, and the
Right. It's
something that has to be finished. And so it's that sense in one's life that there's something I need to do. There's something I want to be. There's something about this moment that is very right. And I know there's something I must leave my career. I must move to a new place. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a positive outcome in the way that you think, but there are those times in life when we say, I know what it's like to be settled, and I'm ready for something different. And more than being ready, life calls you to an adventure, and that's the framework that in which this phenomenon makes the most sense to me.
Well, I think you mentioned in the book that like the chief function of mythology or going on the hero's journey is to carry the human spirit forward. So it's not necessarily like you're going, you answer the call, you're going to have this perfect life. No, not
No.
necessarily, but at least you'll be making progress in some sense.
Exactly. Toward what? I mean, I did fun. Maybe I'll just tell my own introduction, my own separation. I was 12 years old in the sixth grade, elementary school student, when it was my turn to give a current events report for my class. I chose a nearby UFO sighting. I grew up in Northwest Ohio, and nearby Michigan had a 3 or 4 day long, recurring display of lights and apparent craft and all of the details that go with the UFO phenomenon. I had not, I was not a sci-fi guy. I had not read space type stuff. I've never been a huge fan of Star Trek or even Star Wars. I actually tell friends that I probably have seen every episode of the 1960s sitcom, which is still available in reruns, called Green Acres. I often will say that because the premise of this show called Green Acres was that a couple uh, from living in Manhattan decided they wanted to go live on a farm. So they went to a town called Hooterville with a bunch of rural people who had their own way of life, their own frame of reference, and the contrast in the sitcom is between the two city slickers who want to live the ideal life that they think living in the country is like. But there's constant absurdity because their New York, Manhattan assumptions uh, create constant contrast with the down home folks of Hooterville. So I know I came to see the UFO phenomenon as that kind of a clash between an almost absurdist clash at times between the between opposing viewpoints. So in any case, it was my turn to give a current events class. I chose this Michigan sighting, and when it came time to take questions, one of the students in my class said, "Do you think what they saw was aliens from outer space?" And I said, "Well, that's what some people think. That's a major interpretation, but I don't know." Well, then somebody else raised their hand and said, "Well, what do you think they saw?" By the way, the Air Force investigator who came in had said that perhaps, possibly, conceivably, one of the sightings near the edge of town near a swamp could have been swamp gas, which is a natural phenomenon of decomposing natural branches and leaves and so forth. That's a chemical reaction that's given off, which very often lights up. So swamp gas leads to swamp lights, to luminosity around swamps. He did not say, however, that the entire Michigan case was just nothing but swamp gas, only maybe one very small piece, and even then, only possibly. So right away, I got a sense of how this debate is filled with plot turns that that keep us hanging on to the next detail and give both sides what they need to maintain they think they're right. So the student asked, "Well, what do you think they saw?" And I said, "I don't know, but I can tell you this, it didn't sound like swamp gas." And at that point, my teacher came up, and her name was Mrs. Lowry, and she stood next to me. She said, uh, "Everybody, listen up. I think that what Keith is trying to tell us with something like this, or any story, it's important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions." I can still hear, I remember the word relevant. I was 12 years old. It wasn't a big part of my vocabulary, but I knew what she meant. And then she turned to me and in that way that a teacher very often will to with a student, use their full name to make a rhetorical point. She said, "Mr. Thompson, that was a fine report. You have the makings of a reporter, a journalist, or maybe a scientist, possibly a detective. The point is, follow the evidence wherever it leads." Well, I write in the book about that experience being a kind of benediction for me, almost a blessing, as an aspiring adult who was interested in current events, current affairs, saw life as something to be engaged with. Here I had a full-fledged adult, my teacher, essentially affirm my interest and the approach I had taken. I realized that's as a journalist later, that's where I began. That was my first journalistic report. It was an oral report in the same sense that a TV broadcaster might go to their to the correspondent in the field. Very often will say, "And now we go to our correspondent, Bob Schieffer in Ann Arbor. Bob, what are you finding?" They look off the screen and they call on the correspondent who says to Walter Cronkite, "What's going on?" Well, I was giving that kind of a report. So I did not set out that day. I didn't consider myself a UFO investigator, but that experience led me to continue to pay attention to it, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. To me, that was what came out of it. That kind of advice, it has informed everything I've done as a journalist. I've had people say to me since this book has come out, that one interviewer asked, "Keith, how did you go from being an investigative journalist who wrote about education and criminal justice and health and fitness? I've written about a lot of topics. And how did you go from being an investigative journalist with those kind of topics to becoming a UFO person, a UFO researcher?" And I heard the question. I said, "There's something about the question that isn't quite right." And I answered back, "Well, there wasn't a shift. I didn't stop being an investigative journalist. I just directed my investigative journalist skills to a topic that is different, that is not something that can be summed up easily in one article." So it is as an investigative journalist, investigative observer, that I follow the evidence wherever it leads. And I did not, that day in the 12th grade, I did not know about paranormal phenomena. I think I'd heard of that there are some people who might be psychic, but I hadn't thought it through very deeply. It goes with being a 12-year-old. You do what a 12-year-old does, and you think the way a 12-year-old does. But I began to, as I went more deeply into the UFO data, I realized that there are dimensions that are in fact paranormal. They're certainly suggestive of that. So I opened up into another realm of knowledge by expanding that kind of expanding my purview to include all the data.
Well, it's amazing that, you were able to do that as a 12-year-old. I mean, in one sense, I think younger kids are more able to do that than adults once we kind of have, get a little bit rigid in our worldview and perspectives and opinions. But at the same time, to be able to, I think you mentioned the book, become part of the cognitive minority, I think is the term, where you start thinking differently than maybe the rest of the world. And you're like, well, I'm just going to follow the evidence. And if that makes me, in the minority, so be it. I'd rather stay the course and figure out where the evidence takes me. And it's
That
interesting.
phrase cognitive minority, I'm glad you mentioned that. I quote a sociologist named Peter Berger, who came up with that. He said, "Yeah, a cognitive minority is a group of people who believes." His premise is a book called A Rumor of Angels. And he was writing about how in the modern era, the modern rationalist era, the supernatural is assumed no longer to exist, what we call the supernatural. And he argued, however, that there are, just because the supernatural is officially declared not to be real, doesn't mean that the supernatural stops showing up. It's not to say that UFOs are supernatural per se, but they are the same category as supernatural. And so he referred to those who have experiences of the supernatural, spiritual, visionary experiences, end up feeling like cognitive minorities. They know that they profess certain knowledge based on experience. I've seen this, I experienced it for myself, but it makes them a minority. And the UFO phenomenon is a very good example. It's changing, but there is case after case. The question comes up: should I tell people what I've seen? because you report about an officially non-existent phenomenon that makes you a cognitive minority, and that goes with the second stage of initiation. Her parents told Emily in Zimbabwe, you didn't see what you think you saw. It didn't happen. It officially didn't happen. The Bible doesn't have that. Therefore, it didn't happen, what you experienced. So Emily was then struggling with, do I continue to maintain fidelity to my own experience? Do I simply push it away? It's a form of, we use the term gaslighting a lot these days. Her parents didn't gaslight her in a malevolent way. They didn't try to convince her deceitfully for their own interest that she hadn't seen what she said she saw. But there's a kind of there's a kind of gaslighting effect when you instruct people using your authority as a parent, for example, to tell a child that didn't happen. It didn't happen. That is a negation. And whatever happened, that didn't happen is not a useful response.
No, I've been probably very detrimental, and probably why a lot of people keep, or at least in the past, I agree with the sentiment they said, times are changing, where people are more willing to speak about this stuff now because it has gained a certain level of social acceptance. I would say, though, and I think this is a good segue, it's gained social acceptance because of the work of people like you and then others that you've been able to bring on board that lend credibility. So, coming back around to Stanislav Grof, man who pioneered the concept of holotropic breath work to alter our consciousness and resolve trauma potentially. I think Grof makes a big point about how our original first trauma was the trauma of being born, of childbirth, and that's something that most people overlook. But when going through your book, I learned that Grof handed John Mack, the now well-renowned Harvard psychologist, his book with your chapter of his book in specific. And I'm going to butcher the line, but it was something Mack seemed to say to Ralph Blumenthal, who broke that 2017 New York Times article with Leslie Kean about UFOs, that Grof gave me the book, put a hole in my mind, and the UFO entered. And I'm wondering maybe if you could share a little bit about that. And I think you became friends with Mac, if I understand it correctly. He went to the Imperial School, helped give kind of a little bit more support to these 62 kids like Emily who had this experience. And you guys also did things like go to Laurance Rockefeller's ranch to dig in and try and get more people on board, like the Clinton administration. So I know that was kind of a lot, but maybe if you could chime in.
You covered a lot of territory. I'll kind of break it up a bit, but thank you for that, for bringing up John Mack. As a result of my own exploration, I ended up moving to California. I got to know a place called Esalen Institute, which is an educational institute that is really committed to exploring human potential, new approaches to human development, and the full sort of the idea of actualizing more of who we are, and calling on both religion and science to expand their purviews to take in the full range of human capacities, untapped human potentials. So while associated there, spending time at Esalen, I got to know Dr. Stan Grof, who was a Czechoslovakian physician who started out as a researcher with an experimental drug from the 1950s called LSD. Before it was associated with the 60s counterculture, it was considered a psychoactive drug for sure, a psychedelic, which is a term for enhancing the qualities of the psyche, bringing forward the characteristics of psyche. So he had an LSD trip of his own. He administered it in scientific settings, began to realize this was a very profound tool for consciousness exploration and investigation. At the same time, LSD had a course of a life course in which it became forbidden. It was considered declared to be a Schedule I drug. It's considered to be a dangerous drug. That's a whole broad conversation there. In any case, Groth and his late wife, Christina Groth, Stan and Christina Groth, together formulated this method that you call holotropic breathwork, which is the use of systematic breathing at a tempo designed to expand awareness into realms of a larger realm of the psyche. So with that as a kind of a brief introduction, John Mack had come to Esalen for a conference, and he had the opportunity. He was a Freudian based. He was trained as a psychiatrist in the Freudian model, which is essentially agnostic at best. Freud was an atheist. He simply thought religion was a cesspool of human superstition and nothing but that. So he was a materialist who believed consciousness is created entirely by the brain. And he had some interest in psychic phenomena, but he didn't pursue that. That was the life work of Carl Jung. In any case, Mack came to Esalen, had an experience of holotropic breathwork, and had a deep opening into psychic territory that is called the transpersonal, the realm of beyond the personal biography, where myth and spiritual phenomena become part of ordinary reality, to put it simply. And he also experimented with psychedelics and rituals of various kinds. He began to do which is something that is very rare. Began to open his consciousness to the possibility that the maps of science, the maps of Freudian psychiatry, were true but partial, and that there were unfinished realms, unknown, undescribed, unmapped realms. And one of them that caught his attention was the UFO phenomenon in general, specifically the alien abductions. So when he mentioned to his friend Stan Groth, a mutual friend, Stan said, well, John, I'm about to publish an anthology with Christina called Spiritual Emergency, in which we describe a host of different authors describe a host of experiences in life that come on like a spiritual emergency. Something gets activated in someone's life where everything suddenly is upside down, and they've got to go on the journey that Joseph Campbell, or they're moved to go on the kind of journey of exploration that Joseph Campbell described. He said, John, one of the people I'm publishing in the book is a guy named Keith Thompson. And it's his talk that he gave at a conference, which he's turned into an article, is about the sense in which, as we've already discussed, I laid out in this piece, the sense in which the alien abductions, whatever they actually are, we can set aside the reality question, what's going on? And instead, we can start with noting the similarities between how people are taken out of their ordinary realm, abducted by aliens, and then returned, as mirroring the three stages of the rite of passage. So John, as you say, Ralph Blumenthal described in his book, The Believer, John read this with interest. John had eyeglasses like mine, and he often wore them very often John had his glasses he was always reading, always had those eyeglasses nearby. So he spent some time, I'm told, reading this, and he said, I need to get in touch with him. So Stan gave him my email or my phone number, I don't remember which. And John Mack called me and said, we need to talk. You're the only one you're the first person I've talked to about this. But you write this piece, Keith. It was very interesting, the idea that they are like a rite of passage. Fine. But you say you set aside the reality questions in order to develop that idea. Well, what about the reality question? Are they real? So he returned to California. We got together and we began a series of conversations. I was many years younger than he, but I became kind of a mentor for him in some ways. But it was more like a peer relationship. And he drew on my background, my knowledge with mythology and parapsychology and non-ordinary experiences, and attempting to map what's going on. And he became, therefore, deeply involved in the alien abduction phenomenon. He used hypnosis and other investigative techniques, which led to great controversy at Harvard. Harvard questioned his methods, but what they were really questioning most clearly was that this isn't something we want you to be. We don't want to be doing this. We don't want you to be doing. They didn't quite say it that way, but the implication was what they were really looking at was sanctioning him for daring to look into such an aberrant phenomenon. John's response was, I'm a scientist. I'm an investigator. This is a realm that I have already determined based on my knowledge of psychology. There is no known psychological pathology going on with these people. I've done tests on them. Whatever they've experienced cuts across a cross section of people from different walks of life. There is no alien abduction syndrome in a psychological sense. So as a psychiatrist, I want to investigate what could be going on since there's no obvious psychological interpretation. And so that was, he was the investigator. He was the Charles Darwin. He was like Freud, like Jung. He, in a different era, choosing alien abductions faithfully. He went into it and went at it. And eventually Harvard said they realized what they were dealing with. Harvard realized that if they went down the road of sanctioning John Mack, it would not be a victory for freedom of speech. So they cleared him, if you will, and John continued to study this phenomenon until unfortunately, just 2 decades ago, he met an untimely death in an automobile accident in London. He was crossing the street and was struck by a car. Only survived about an hour. And then we're coming up on the 20th anniversary just next month.
Well, I'm certainly sorry he left us before his time, but also grateful for the mark he could leave on, both of us and many others out there. I think he, from what I know of John and his work, he gave a lot of people a voice, that otherwise wouldn't have been taken seriously, especially several decades ago.
Well, he coined, I don't know if he himself coined the term experiencers, but he generally came to prefer the term experiencer as a broader category than abductee. Because while some of the encounters, the close encounters, they're called close encounters of the fourth kind. And abduction is generally the term because there is, with many of the cases, it's a good word. People are forcibly interacting with beings who appear to be alien and do not appear to be human. And he was very interested in giving, as you say, the experiencers a voice, helping them deal with the trauma that goes with this. There were psychological issues for experience. There are psychological issues, but what John often said was they don't come with pre-existing psychological disorders, but they very often have issues of adjustment to the reality. One reason he did like my idea of the initiatory framework, he understood that experiencers, if they do not have an opportunity to complete the experience psychologically, come to terms with it, if it isn't validated as experientially real, then they will stay in that wasteland that Emily Trim stayed in Zimbabwe and Canada. So he came at this as a psychiatrist in the healing profession. And he also came to have some disagreement with other abduction researchers. He began to advocate more strongly than the 2 other leading abduction researchers, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. John, compared to them, began to see that the phenomena that was being displayed was not easy to fit into the Western model of, these events, these craft and their apparent occupants seem to come from another world into this world. But they're not of this world. They interact here and then they depart. So what does that coming and going mean? Coming from where to here? He began to feel that we needed a larger dimensional model of physics and reality. And he became an advocate for this issue. Why are we so insistent upon demanding that the phenomena shrink to meet our pre-existing categories? Rather than why are we not willing to expand our pre-existing categories to meet the data? And that was where John and I were really in agreement, thanks to my 6th grade teacher, who had told me, follow the evidence wherever it leads. So to this day, I cannot fully give an account of what's going on with the alien experience, with the alien abduction experience. But I do remember when my first book, Angels and Aliens, came out, I was on a TV show, a CNN TV show at the time called Larry King Live. And Larry King was a legendary broadcaster from the old school. And at the end of the interview, he had this kind of gruff voice. He said, Mr. Thompson, we're going out on this question. Do the abductions really happen? Are they real? And I said, well, Larry, it depends on how we define reality. He said, no. Are they real? I'm not going to let you off the hook. I said, okay, John, or Larry, let me answer it this way. if you or I had the experience that is called an alien abduction, if we experienced what abductees report, we would believe it was real. And he just kind of did a double take. He goes, if I had the experience, if you had the experience, we'd think it was real. Well, that answers it. But we need a different way to think about reality. So he came around to my view that we need to think about what is real. Well, that's a fascinating question. It's beyond our time here. Thank you very much, and so on and so forth. So that little interchange really summarized it. He wanted me not to go into the larger stuff about, well, we need a larger map of reality. He said, no, are they real? And that's what I say. They are they're real experiences. As to the full nature of the events that the experiences are based on, it's unclear. Are they from other galaxies that are finding their way in here? Are they from other dimensions? And is it phenomena that has been part of our culture, part of our life? This is one of the key turning points in the field of UFO research that I cover. And that is that Jacques Vallée, a French astronomer and a writer on this subject, prolific writer, wrote a book in the late 60s called Passport to Magonia. Magonia referred to a fanciful French mythological, an aspect of French mythology, European mythology. And so he had determined that, having long studied the UFO phenomenon under the likelihood that it probably was extraterrestrial and was probably a new novel phenomenon of the modern age, he began to shift his perspective. He began to see that if you study other cultures and their folklore and mythology, the fairy faith of the Celtic countries, where fairies abduct babies and leave non-human babies instead, changelings. Well, one view is John shouldn't be bringing that stuff in, because Jacques Vallée should not be bringing that stuff in, because that's obviously just mythology and folklore. And Vallée's response was always just very, very sincere. He would, with his French accent, he would say, on what basis do you automatically dismiss what we consider to be mere folklore and mythology? Well, cannot the same be said for the modern reports of UFOs? Are they too not maybe just folklore and mythology? So he was an advocate for expanding the framework and looking at various cultural phenomena that seem to show this is a larger phenomenon that seems to appear to different cultures in forms that are consistent with their belief system. And he began to believe something that I myself take very seriously. Whatever the intelligence involved is about, whatever the full nature of the intelligence, this is a phenomenon that is communicating with us symbolically. And therefore, the events are not easy to translate and transcribe in a literal sense. Happened, didn't happen. Real, unreal. This is a phenomenon that cuts deeper than that and is influencing our belief system by presenting us with vivid yet ambiguous phenomena, with fugitive presence. Seemingly, it seems to be trying to avoid detection. And yet, absolutely. Vallée often said, it appears it wants us to think it is trying to avoid. In other words, he's not a paranoid, but he began to think that this phenomenon might be about the very business of shaping human belief systems. And in that way, in that sense, it would be presenting us with events almost like AI, artificial intelligence, or virtual reality. And I'm not an authority in those areas, but there are aspects of the phenomenon that are very much like three-dimensional holograms. They appear to interact with our three dimensions of space and one of time, and yet they disappear, like the Cheshire Cat disappears, but there's only the smile left, the Cheshire Cat's smile. It's very much like Alice in Wonderland. It's very much like magical realism, that genre of films, like Field of Dreams. A farmer is out in his cornfield one day and hears a voice that says, if you build it, they will come. And he looks up to his wife, who said that? What's that about? And he eventually gets some instructions that he's supposed to mow down all of his corn, build a baseball field. So he eventually meets his father. I mean, it's fiction, it's fantasy, but it is like the UFO phenomenon compared with Harry Potter, which is all magical from the beginning, all fantastical at every stage. magical realism is different. It starts with the assumption that ordinary reality is in place, and then there are these punctuations, these eruptions of the magical, which in cultures that have magical realist traditions, especially South American, Spanish cultures, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and 100 Days of Solitude, magnificent magical realism novel. In those cultures, there's the understanding that magic is actually part of the everyday fabric of life. I would say the UFO phenomenon is like that, in the sense that it comes and goes on some schedule of its own and constantly is calling us to consider that there's more going on here in reality itself than we generally accept.
Well, it reminds me of a few things. First, what you point out in your book, like ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, they all have this concept of subtler aspects of reality. And then that brings me to a friend of mine who's in tune with this subject, often uses Bohm's framework of the explicit order and the implicit order of reality. And I view those as comparable ideas, that there's almost there's the physical dense level of matter and reality, but then there are subtler and subtler forms of that escape our perception. And it's also, like you say in the book, sometimes the subtle makes itself a little bit more known than it typically is. Or finally, maybe I'd compare it to Carl Sagan. There's a video of him, I forget what the program was back in the day, but how he describes a 4D being entering 3D space, and how it, might appear to us, if you stuck your finger on a flat table, well, the being on the flat table might see a circle, when really it's, on the 4D level, or the 3D level, it's an entire finger. So I guess I'm mixing a bunch of different ideas here, but I guess the thought being that there are aspects of a broader reality that seem to poke in and make themselves known, and that seems to be characteristic of the UFO phenomenon to an extent.
Yes, and these could be these apparent objects could be windows or portals into that large. They could be openings into a larger reality. At minimum, it is a larger reality, whatever its full nature is. But you've touched on a lot of good stuff. There's just so much to work with. In particular, the cultures you mentioned, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so forth, even ancient Greece, had language for not just the body, but different levels of embodiment. In the esoteric and spiritual traditions, such as Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, I believe it's pronounced, the theosophical literature has the astral body, the subtle body, causal body, mental body. The astral body is the body that leaves the physical body and out-of-body experiences. So we don't have that language. We don't have language of subtle bodies, except in martial arts studios. They talk about chi and ki, and they work with subtle energy, and they take it quite seriously. And a true master of the martial arts comes to understand that there's an truly esoteric and mystical aspect to advance. All martial arts are not the same. Some are more explicitly, grossly physical, but some of the paths, such as Aikido, deal with the energy body. So, in any case, that's an interest. The reason I brought in the energy body, the subtle bodies that we don't have in our culture, was to raise the question of to what extent are experiences that seem to be happening at the physical level actually happening at subtle physical levels. And because we don't have that category, we don't have language for my astral body. When a person believes they're being levitated out of their home into a spacecraft above their house, what exactly is happening in that? How does the physical body move through walls? Well, one answer might be, and I'm not reducing the alien abduction experience to this, but it could very well be that there is some interaction happening where the person is in their astral body. They're in their celestial body. They are moving in a realm with very vivid forms, real aliens. There is something to be noted about the fact that different people from different walks of life do report types of alien morphologies, the short grays, the tall whites. I mean, there are people in this field who are authorities on the anatomy of the various aliens and the sense in which these types keep getting repeated. So there is a coherence to the forms that are described, but how many levels of reality are these involved with? I speculate in the book, since the abductions are an involuntary phenomenon in most cases. People feel paralyzed and unable to move when they are taken by aliens and then experimented on. I actually present a thought challenge. I said, what if the next, since abductions are regular experiences, sometimes more than one experience for an abductee, sometimes lifetime experiences. What if abductees were given the opportunity to get training in working with their astral bodies, in gaining facility to move between different levels of being, different types of embodiment? For that matter, what if all of our education, what if, I mean, this is highly speculative and highly fanciful. I know the answer to why public schools are not going to teach people to develop psychic capacities, because it's too upsetting for that level to be taken as established reality. Too complicated, but it's certainly a premise that is it. Guess what I'm getting at here is this phenomenon coaxing us, calling us to a larger sense of reality. We're meeting them on in the. I say in the book that abductees are interacting with the abductors on common ground. They are in some shared space by the very nature of the abductee being able to report that they went through the experience. There are aspects of it that do not support a strictly 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, but there's a real common ground. So is it that this is calling us into more awareness of our own multidimensionality, such that we might be learning to interact with these other beings? Is it part of nature's agenda that human beings recover some capacities that the Western model has completely written off? So that's a speculative place I go to, especially in a chapter that you may remember called Who Do We Think We Are? In that chapter, I simply set the UFO frame of reference totally aside, look at various fields of study, medicine, human experience across the board. Let me give you an example. And that these experiences point to a larger sense of mind-body connections that we don't develop and that tend to emerge in weird ways. For example, the placebo phenomenon. That is the case. That is the example where two groups of subjects, experimental subjects and control group, are going to be given a test medicine for, say, pain relief. Everybody in the 2 groups knows that not everybody's going to get the real medicine. Some will get the dummy pill. Nobody's going to know who will, including the researchers won't know who will. They don't want to signal expectations. It turns out repeatedly, if everybody believing they might have got the real pain medicine, that it turns out people who did not get the real pain medicine achieve comparable pain relief as those who do get it. And those who did not get the real medicine but got the pain relief, thinking they got the real medicine, also tend to get higher percentage of the same experience of the side effects. So it's not real medicine. You didn't get the real medicine. You thought you might have. And based on that, you not only got the pain relief, but you also got the side effects associated with the medicine. That speaks to a level of mental, of the power of expectation, the power of belief in changing physical embodied experience. So the mind body, what I'm arguing in that chapter is the division between mind and body is not as firm, as strong as we think it is. It's far more like a permeable membrane rather than a sharp dividing wall. So there are numerous experiences within the everyday human realm of untapped mind-body capacities, which are not recognized, and therefore they're considered random noise. What if we would identify the pattern And I mean, can you imagine if people could be somehow trained to create the placebo effect by marshaling more of their healing capacities? We would change our entire framework for medicine and healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, it would be. I mean, well, it seems that places like Esalen or the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which you mentioned earlier, are out there helping people do just that. But it certainly hasn't reached the masses in a transformational way yet. I'm sure there's like a certain threshold that would gain mainstream acceptance, and I'm willing to bet that we are on our way there, but sadly
Well,
not fast enough,
if
in my
if
opinion.
if consciousness is fundamental in a way that our science has not understood, and that's one of the things I raise in the book, one of the key points, that it may be that we will see that consciousness, which is not even factored into most of our scientific discussions, the very fact that consciousness is the sense that there's something, consciousness, is simply simple definition of consciousness is there's something it is like. I know I'm conscious because there's something it is like to be myself. There's something it is like for you to be yourself. You're conscious that you are. I am. I am aware. I exist. That is the most fundamental datum of human experience that we can imagine. So it could very well be that in future formulations, as in a future paradigm of science, will recognize consciousness is as fundamental as gravity. Perhaps it's one of the fundamental factors, and if so, then we open out of this long sleep of materialist uh, philosophy, materialist science, which has been very helpful. You can do good materialist science to get to the moon, create iPhones, and do healthcare, medical achievements. There's a lot to be said for it, but it is not a broad enough model to account for the full range of human experience. And you're right, there are the places like Esalen and the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and then more widely in the culture, mindfulness meditation is widespread now in corporate settings, in community, in churches. So, if more and more people are meditating, more and more people are using visualization, using techniques of self-exploration involving systematically shifting consciousness, is it possible that we're changing the very baseline level of consciousness? Consciousness is not a static thing in that sense. So that more people who, in some sense, we create reality is what I'm getting at. And I don't want to be simplistic about that and so forth. But in some sense, mind is emergent and mind is causal. Mind is causal. Consciousness is a causal factor in ways that our official science don't explain. But when you can imagine that you've taken a medicine, but you've not taken that medicine, but you achieve the benefits as well as the side effects, that says something about the causal factors of mind and expectation that's worth paying attention to. And so, how does that connect with UFOs? Well, it's UFOs show the very behavior of crossing over between mental and physical. Objects that show up on radar in one setting, in one scene, suddenly split into orbs of light and float away, or dive into the ground and disappear. They often the UFO that appears on radar will disappear much the way a early TV set, when you turn it off, it resolves into simply a dot on the screen. Rather than flying away, just disappears like a spot. That doesn't make it easy. I understand why many in the UFO field feel more comfortable with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because if they're only slightly more advanced spacecraft than we have, that doesn't require a change in our fundamental worldview. I'm not in favor of a change in our fundamental worldview because that's my preference. I believe we need to expand our maps because the evidence points in that direction. And I'm a follow the evidence wherever it leads kind of guy.
Well, I mean, I think that we could all take a note from you and put our biases aside and try and do that in every aspect of our lives, not just as it relates to UFOs, but consciousness, our everyday actions, politics, journalism, etc., follow the evidence, and I think we would be in a much better place.
I'm going to share a
Um,
conversation just in the ways in which it's often very ordinary reality as a way of reinforcing it. A friend of mine was recently telling me that she doesn't like where she's living. People aren't very friendly, and I heard that, and I kind of just said, I'm not buying it. So I said, did you go to the grocery today? Did you do any errands? She said, yeah, I did. I said, did you say hello to any new people? And immediately she knew what I was getting at. The world seemed unfriendly to her because the people to whom she did not say hello also did not say hello to her. And the way she framed that was so many unfriendly people. But how do we know that they didn't go home and say, oh, I saw this woman, she had this gloomy look on her face? So I told her, I said, this is not meant to sound like Pollyanna, but practice going to the grocery and saying hello to somebody that you don't have to say hello to. Watch what happens. Very often the person will go, do I know you? And my response is, oh, you do now. I just saying hello. And they'll say, well, thank you. Thank you for saying hello. Well, what did I just have? What did I just have? I just had a friendly experience. Hey, the town is friendlier than I thought. So the abstraction, this is a friendly town or not a friendly town, starts with me. Friendliness starts with us, as well
no,
as
I,
not friendly.
yeah, no, I love that. I mean, what we carry out into the world often shapes our perception of it. And, I usually ask people as we're wrapping up, what's one message for the world? But I think you kind of just hit it right out of the park with that. Like, if the world seems unfriendly to you, maybe take a look inside and see what you're bringing out into the world. If I could paraphrase that sentiment.
Yeah, another one I would share is what keeps me going with this is the Zen master Suzuki Roshi, as you may know, wrote a famous book called Beginner's Mind, which he advocated beginner's mind as an attitude to approach anything. By beginner's mind, he defined the difference between being a beginner and an expert. And he said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So he said, be a beginner. Approach any situation with a sense there may be many possibilities in this instant. Whereas the expert often has reached conclusions of overgeneralizing about what is and what is not possible. And so they're not open to certain possibilities because they know in their mind, they're pretty certain they know enough to know that that's not possible. So in the beginner's mind are many possibilities, in the expert's mind are few. That sense of beginner's mind, when I discovered that distinction, it just stays with me. And I approach this phenomenon and other phenomena like it with beginner's mind. And I urge our viewers to try that out in their lives. Any new situation, approach it as a beginner with a sense of, in other words, approach it like a child. Notice how children have not yet been, until they're taught what's possible and what's not possible. Children believe in all kinds of remarkable things. Doesn't make them true, but it makes them real. And that itself makes the possibility. Thinking in terms of possibilities generally makes for better outcomes.
I think it's really sound advice and something I could probably do a better job of myself. So I will keep that in the back of my mind. Look, Keith, I want to be respectful of your time. You've already been really generous here. There's a lot of things with the book that we didn't go over, like, Bigelow and his group's influence on the scene, your trip out to Laurance Rockefeller's ranch, and how that influenced, the Clinton administration to take a look into Roswell and, where ufology is going as a whole. But, I think that's okay. Like, I want there to be some mystery left for the viewers because it's a worthwhile book, and I encourage everybody to go get the physical copy, or I believe it's on Audible now as well, too. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's physical book, ebook, Audible at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And I give my website also for it's possible to order the book there as well. And my website is thompsonatlarge.com. Thompson with a P, @large.com.
We will be sure to link the book and where you can purchase it in the description of the YouTube video, as well as a link to your website. And definitely encourage everybody to check out your work. It was an absolute joy for me. I annotated and drew in the book like crazy, just highlighting things that were super interesting. So nobody can have my copy because they won't be able to read it because I marked it up so much. But go out and get your own for sure, and you won't be disappointed. Keith, just want to say thanks again. This was awesome to get to know you a little bit. Appreciate you giving me and everyone else a little look into your world and all the excellent research you've done over many, many years. And, we'll hope to stay with you and stay up to date as you continue your work, because definitely somebody that I view as bringing a lot of knowledge and insight to a very complex subject. So thanks again for being here and being willing to share your wisdom with us.
Well, consider me a fellow paradigm Sherpa.
Oh, indeed. Absolutely.
I mean, that's a great concept you've got, the Sherpa doing the heavy lifting in the mountain areas. When you're going up the hill, you need a Sherpa to help carry some stuff. And that's what a paradigm shift is about. It's when all the anomalies that begin to accumulate, that begin to say, hey, this is not a settled view of reality after all. There's too many pieces that don't fit. And that's how, I use Galileo's famous experience. He used his computations and his telescope to conclude that the Earth orbited the sun, not vice versa. And one day he got a call, metaphorically speaking, from the Vatican at his door, probably. The religious officials at the time said, you must stop saying this because the sun orbits the Earth. And Galileo said, you don't have to take my word for it. It's not a question of faith or just assertion. A look at my computations and have a look through my telescope. And famously, the church refused to look at either. They refused to look through the telescope, especially. They refused to avail themselves of the one means by which they could either confirm or disconfirm what he was saying. And they told him if he kept saying this about the heavens, they would put him under house arrest, which they eventually did. So, the irony now is that the role of the Vatican is very often played by mainstream science. They're so totally convinced that the materialist view of science is the same as science per se. No, it's a particular view. Science per se is not materialist. It's evidence-based for phenomena of various kinds. And we can take the scientific method and explore mind-body relationships and consciousness as well as matter. And by the way, what is matter? The closer we look to find what matter is, it disappears. At the quantum level, there are no particles. There are only fields with ripples. So anyway, the larger conversation is hard to begin to fade out. And it's difficult if I raise new topics. But anyway, all of this is stuff that I talk about in the book, and it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I really appreciate it. And yeah, maybe we can have you back some other time and get into more stuff. But I think this is a great, at least, teaser for the book. Get people excited and get to explore some of the stuff in more depth. So thanks again, and again, really appreciate you being here.